What do you get when you have a wealth tax, quid pro quo, and eugenics all in the same week? You get the Democratic Party. Yes, believe it or not, all of those three words were used and were stories this week. Luckily for you, the viewer or the listener, whichever one you are preferencing at this point in time, only a few, and by a few, I mean two of those three things are actually serious enough for us to talk about them here on this week's show, Critical Thinking. Yes, I'm Andrew Coppins, your host of Critical Thinking and the host with the most numbers right here on Mojo 50 Radio. You can follow me on the social media site of your choice at The Coppins Show. For those of you that are new, my last name, Coppens, Coppens. And of course, if you're listening to the show via podcast, you can always check it out 5 p.m. Central Time every Saturday. You can also see the show live in its entirety every Saturday as well. You can just simply go over to the Mojo 50 Radio Facebook page, hit the like button, never miss a single episode of this show, live and direct. And since we're heading into the winter months, may I suggest hibernating with me on the weekends? Whatever are we going to be talking about on this show? Well, we mentioned quid pro quo. And, well, does it mean what the Dems believe it to have meant this week? Or does it mean nothing like the Republicans have been telling us? Did you know that while all this was going on, the Patriot Act was kicked down the road a little bit further? And the newest continuing resolution is why it happened? Did you even know there was a continuing resolution that passed? We're also going to talk about Elizabeth Warren and her wealth tax, and, well, that's going to get the by-the-numbers treatment later on in the show. And finally, we're going to talk about the Dems' latest attempt to end around the Constitution and the Second Amendment. I promise you, this is about as prophetic as I have ever been in the entirety of this show. Literally, we are 21 episodes into this show, and I believe my prophecy came in somewhere around episodes 13, 14, somewhere in there. Believe it or not, we have a prediction coming sort of true. But before we get into all of that, everybody, the thing that was all the rage in Washington, D.C., and literally sucking up all of the media attention was the words quid pro quo. Once again this week, naturally, because what else does Washington, D.C. have to do? But this was because Ambassador Gordon Sondland testified in front of the impeachment inquiry charade, aka a hearing. If you were on the left, his testimony told you that, well, guess what? There was a quid pro quo for Donald Trump. Now, if you're on the right, it was actually time to attack Gordon Sondland and what he had to say in his opening statement. And what you ended up getting were sound bites that were literally contradictory to each other. So what in the hell is the actual truth? Well, first off, here's what Ambassador Sondland actually had to say.
Fourth, as I testified previously, Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. But I believe I just asked him an open-ended question, Mr. Chairman. What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories and this and that. What do you want? And it was a very short, abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Something to that effect.
So that first clip that you saw was the use of quid pro quo in his opening statement. The second clip, that was no quid pro quo in his answer to the questions from committee chairman Adam Schiff. So could you see how this would be super confusing? I certainly can, but only if you weren't paying attention to key words. And judging by how the Democrats actually went about all of this on Wednesday, I'll give you a hint. The Dems would like you and I to not pay attention to the actual words. And it's exactly why Adam Schiff literally stopped the hearing, went out, scrambled in front of the media, and delivered his little quid pro quo speech. So what were the key words here that really matter when you're looking at deciding, was there quid pro quo from Donald Trump? Well, let's start with the first clip. And notice that he says the words Rudy Giuliani and quid pro quo. He's not talking about Donald Trump specifically. He is saying that Rudy Giuliani, okay, offered up at the behest of Donald Trump, but the offer was, I will give you a White House visit. I will work to give you a White House visit. This is Rudy Giuliani saying, I will work to give you a White House visit if you give us a public announcement of investigations into the 2016 election and the alleged meddling that Ukrainian officials, along with American NGOs, the State Department, the CIA, all of those things that were going on in 2016, as well as Burisma, which also happens to be Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and all of that sort of situation. Okay, so that's the alleged quid pro quo. Now, I hate to break it to you folks, this is not some like super nefarious thing that's being asked between Rudy Giuliani and the Ukrainians. For me, this is literally how I could imagine all diplomacy or negotiations of any kind ever going. In fact, I can tell you from firsthand experience in the business world, it's not necessarily quid pro quo, but this is how easily you could spin it. If I were to get into a negotiation with you, if I were to get into a negotiation with you, what would that negotiation look like? It would be maybe you saying, I'm going to offer you 3 years at 10%. I come back and say, I'm not doing 3 years at 10%. I'm only signing with you for 2 years at 7%. You have the ability to say yes or no to that specific deal. The Ukrainians had the ability to say yes or no. We're not going to give up a public announcement just to get a White House visit. And it turns out that's exactly what happened here, folks, when you take a look at the history. There has been no public announcement of an investigation in the Ukraine. There has been no White House visit. It's literally negotiating to get something. Now, the bigger question is a question that I will talk about a little bit later when it comes to quid pro quo. But then the second question that I have about this whole first proclamation from Ambassador Sondland. Is this really the best that the Democrats have on this case? Because let's remember, this is the only person who was on that July 25th call. This was the star of all star witnesses, right? This was all that they could come up with? A guy who literally said no quid pro quo in his sworn testimony? If so, my word, are the Dems' impeachment inquiry hopes and removal hopes in trouble. And the polling on this, by the way, is definitely trending away from the Dems super fast. In fact, let's just go to an article from The Hill earlier this week. It says here that a new national survey finds independent voters leading a sharp swing in opposition to impeachment, the second major poll to produce these findings this week. The latest national poll from Emerson College finds 45% oppose impeaching President Trump against 43% who support it. That's a 6-point swing in support from October, when 48% of the voters supported impeachment and only 44% opposed. More importantly, the poll shows more independents now oppose impeachment than support it, a significant change from Emerson's polling in October. The new poll found 49% oppose impeachment compared to 34% who support it. In October, 48% of independents polled supported impeachment. 48-34. Okay? 39% in October opposed. Now, 49%. That's of independents nationally in a poll. Furthermore, since October, Emerson has found Trump's job approval rating jumped by 5 points, from 43% to 48%. This is the second poll this week to show voters are increasingly likely to oppose impeachment, despite wall-to-wall media coverage of the House hearings that have produced bombshell testimony about how Trump threatened to withhold financial aid to Ukraine if the country did not open an investigation into former Vice President Joe Biden, a top contender for the Democratic presidential nomination. Now, I'm going to let that whole paragraph just marinate on you because, my God, bombshell testimony and threatened to withhold financial aid if the country didn't open an investigation? Is that really what happened? No. These people did not do their homework, but they did their homework on the polling numbers, which is important here. Now, the other component of this is swing states, right? The president has got to be able to keep states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania in the red category. If he does so, the chances of him winning re-election are super great. But more importantly, his margin for victory in the Electoral College becomes almost unbeatable. And let's take a look at one of these states. A Marquette University survey out of Wisconsin, according to The Hill, which is a battleground state that Trump turned red in 2016 for the first time in decades, found 40% think the president should be impeached and removed, against 53% who do not think so. In October, that same Marquette University survey said 44% favored impeachment and removal and 51% opposed. Only 36% of independent respondents in Wisconsin support impeachment and removal. So what does this tell us? This tells us that this impeachment inquiry was a massive miscalculation on the part of the Democrats. And for me, this is twofold when you look at it from a critical thinking perspective. Okay, so the first thing is that when they were behind closed doors, what were the Dems able to do? Selectively leak information and control the narrative that was being put out in front of the American public via their wonderful friends and allies in the media. In the mainstream media, they were just gobbling up whatever the Dems were going to give them, as if it was just the gospel truth. Instead, what we have now found that, with the same people coming in front of the hearing or the committee in the light of day with cameras on, people hearing them with their own two ears and seeing them with their own two eyes, are finding out that this just doesn't seem to be as evil and nefarious and personally important as the Dems were telling us a month ago. So what is happening here is that as things have become more public, support for the Democratic position has become less and less. That is not how the Dems would like to play this out. The Dems would love for each and every one of us to start further opposing Donald Trump, further supporting impeachment and removal, because they have boxed themselves into a corner. So what's in front of the Dems right now is two things. One, they can end this impeachment inquiry, then take a vote and impeach Donald Trump, bring it to the Senate for removal, and get further embarrassed. Or they could recognize that heading into the 2020 election cycle, they should probably just pump the brakes, end the inquiry, and say, you know what, as we did the inquiry, as we discovered during the inquiry, we just don't have the evidence. The evidence just doesn't support impeachment, and we're rational, sane, and most importantly, fair-minded individuals. Now, if I were to be somebody advising them, that's the route that I actually take. And here's why. Because it's all about the 2020 election. If you were to say, hey, you know what, folks, we want to be fair-minded. We want to show that, we see the evidence. We want to hear the American people. We're listening to you. We're not tone-deaf people. We're not all impeachment. We're not all the way out to get Donald Trump before the election. And I would couch it with this. We trust the American people to take the information that was given to them in this inquiry and do what? Take it to the ballot box next November. Give that message to the American people. Put it in their hands. Let them be the ones to decide. Now, on the flip side, the news is not so good because it seems like as this thing keeps going further and further, the people pull further and further away from the Democratic Party and thus closer and closer to re-electing Donald Trump. But your best chance of actually knocking Trump out of office is not with impeach and remove. It is with set up this information, let the American people make the decision, and let yourselves look like the fair-minded people that you're not looking like right now. Now, by the way, that was just the first of those key statements. In the second statement, what you heard was the word no, as in no quid pro quo from Donald Trump. No quid pro quo from Donald Trump. So, we have an admission of one side of quid pro quo in terms of the classical definition, and then on the other side we say no from President Donald Trump. And again, I want to harp on this. This is coming from Ambassador Gordon Sondland, who is the only person in these entire impeachment inquiry hearings so far to testify who was actually on that July 25th phone call. So if there was an actual quid pro quo that happened on the phone call, Sondland would know about it. Instead, what does he say? He says that throughout the entirety of this entire situation, President Trump has never said the words quid pro quo. President Trump has never indicated that there must be this for this, blah, blah, blah. Okay? He says there was never an indication. In fact, Donald Trump has said the word to him specifically, no quid pro quo. He says that he didn't want anything in return, just that Zelensky does the right thing. And in his mind, I'm sure doing the right thing is investigating Burisma, thus the Bidens and all of that. What does it all mean again? Well, it means in this particular case, the Democrats are lying liars. They came out and said there is quid pro quo from Donald Trump. No, there isn't. And Ambassador Sondland literally said it. Is there a potential for quid pro quo? Yes. And it actually exists with Rudy Giuliani, not Donald Trump. So if you want to get anybody on a quid pro quo situation, it would be Rudy Giuliani. There's just one problem. He doesn't actually serve inside the government. So, oops-a-daisies. But it also, on the flip side, means that Republicans, just unequivocal, there was no quid pro quo, nothing to see here. Not exactly true either. What it comes down to at this point is, do you believe that trading an investigation for access to the White House is quid pro quo or bribery, or it's just normal diplomacy? I'm not going to tell you what to think on this, but ask yourself the question, think about it, and come to your own conclusion. Personally, I don't find anything wrong with what either Rudy Giuliani or Trump were doing in this case. Now, I want to make this clear because how do you get world leaders to help with an investigation or to look at this any differently? Okay? How do you think world leaders of non-G5 or whatever countries you would like to say would get an invitation into the White House ever? Well, they would have something of value to offer for said meeting. Maybe it's just good PR, or you're a cool new individual, so let's get pictures together. Maybe you've got some oil. Maybe there's a strategic economic advantage on the doorstep of a hostile nation you could be. Those little old chestnuts of diplomacy. If you want to trade parts of your relationship, trading information, trading, oil, or whatever, right? Trading goods, and then guaranteeing that you get into the White House for that. Is that a quid pro quo or just a business dealing? Is investigating potential corruption inside your own country in return for a White House meeting nefarious? I don't think so. Ultimately, for me, this is just diplomacy done super clumsily, not unethically, and certainly not illegally. If this is the standard that the Dems have set, and I laid that out last week, we're going to call every single thing impeachable from here to eternity at this point. Oh, and one more point. By the way, Those who are screaming, what about a foreign power doing the internal investigation of U.S. citizens? You do realize that the evidence suggests that people inside the DOJ and the State Department were literally implicated in some of the 2016 corruption charges. And by the way, there are actually people in the Ukraine who are sitting in prison right now for meddling in the 2016 election on behalf of the Democratic National Committee. So we needed this information from the Ukraine. They could have easily done one of two things. Just done the internal investigation, handed it over to Bill Barr and some of the higher-ups that Donald Trump would have trusted inside the DOJ, and let them do the work here in the United States. What do you know? What do you know? It's just as simple as that. It happens all the time, by the way. All the time. We get information from MI5. We get information from the German intelligence services. Right? We get information from all over the world about illegal activities happening with and without United States citizens. To suggest that we shouldn't do that in this case is asinine. We should be demanding that they investigate whether or not the people inside their own country, were coordinating with American citizens to illegally meddle in the 2016 election. It's just that simple. Just that simple for me. But, guess what wasn't simple? Walking and chewing gum at the same time for the mainstream media this week. Because while the national media was too busy, playing footsie with Adam Schiff and all of the impeachment stuff, Congress actually decided to sneak in a continuing resolution this week. One that included, wait for it, a continuing resolution for the Patriot Act. Because those two things go together. Continuing resolution for funding of the government, and then continuing resolution of the documentation of the Patriot Act. Thankfully, at least Justin Amash attempted to strip the Patriot Act out of this continuing resolution, only to make the two sides fight over it on its own. And thankfully, somebody said no. Unfortunately for him, obviously he was overruled in this case because, who wouldn't want to kick the Patriot Act into March of next year, which, by the way, will then get it kicked later on to 2020 and eventually well into 2021, because at that point, nobody running for president is going to want to touch the football of the Patriot Act with a 10-foot pole. And I'll also point to this thing from this tweet, from Eric Boehm of Reason. He had this amazing tweet on this issue earlier this week stating, at the same time that Democrats are holding impeachment inquiries to determine if President Donald Trump abused his executive power, they apparently have no qualms about letting him continue to spy on Americans. So I'm going to leave you with that little nugget of information. Okay, think about that. The Dems are screaming bloody murder that he abuses his executive power. Yet, they just voted to allow the largest amount of executive power, the largest amount of spying on American residents as humanly possible. So I want you to think about that. They're literally saying, Donald Trump's abusing power, Donald Trump's abusive, blah, blah, blah. But we're okay handing him and the FBI, CIA, NSA, all of the human power to spy on Americans possible. They're literally trying to make the case that he was wanting information on my fellow Americans, but let's give it to him anyway. All right, folks, would you hear that music? That means it is about time for us to hit the break here on this side of the episode. So don't forget, follow me on social media at The Coppens Show, COPPENS, COPPENS, at Mojo50 Radio as well. On the flip side, we'll be talking Elizabeth Warren and the By the Numbers segment. We'll also talk about the Second Amendment and the Dems' latest attempt to end around that amendment in the Constitution, right here on Mojo50 Radio. Hopefully you got a chance to refresh that beverage or refresh the brain, whatever you like. But we're back here on Critical Thinking. I'm your host, Andrew Coppins, and you know the drill. Follow me at The Coppins Show, Coppens, Coppens. And of course, you can always see this show live on the Facebook page for Mojo 50 Radio, but you can always catch clips of this show and the show in its entirety over at my YouTube page. Just type in Andrew Coppins. You will see Critical Thinking with Andrew Coppins pop up. Hit the subscribe button. And folks, the more people that subscribe over on YouTube, even if you don't like what they're doing to conservatives, the more people that subscribe, the more chances you get for me, myself, and I to actually be able to do the show more often for you. Simply head over to YouTube, hit the subscribe button, and you are all set and ready to go. Now, notice how, by the way, we have not touched the Democratic debate that happened on Wednesday night, right on the heels of Ambassador Sondland's testimony and all of the things that were going on inside the Democratic Party. Well, turns out there's a reason for it. Rachel Maddow is a moderator. I want you to picture that on the Republican side. Could you imagine Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or Glenn Beck hosting and moderating a debate as if they're not just going to toss up opinion questions that are softballish? That's exactly what happened. It was, please attack the Republicans for 2 hours. But during the debate, they managed to sneak in a few topics that actually mattered. And one of those topics that piqued my curiosity was that of Elizabeth Warren and the wealth tax. That is a topic that I've covered a few episodes ago. So just go ahead, if you have not listened to episode 17 yet, go ahead, check out episode 17. There is a segment, I believe it is the opening segment of the second half of the show, just like this one. But the segment was all about breaking down the myths within the wealth tax and the myths of how things were calculated via the people who are putting together Elizabeth Warren's plans. But the basic gist from Warren on Wednesday night is that she's going to take more money from those who have $50 million or more, and then even more money from those who are worth over $1 billion. There's just one massive problem. She's hiding half of the facts in that the crap that she spewed on stage Wednesday night, not even close to the truth on any level. Here's what Warren had to say on that issue on Wednesday night.
I think the way we achieve our goals and bring our country together is we talk about the things that unite us. And that is that we want to build an America that works for the people, not one that just works for rich folks. You know, I have proposed a 2-cent wealth tax. That is a tax for everybody who has more than $50 billion in assets. Your first $50 billion is free and clear. But your 50 billionth and first dollar, you got to pitch in 2 cents. And when you hit $1 billion, you got to pitch in a few pennies more. Here's the thing. Doing a wealth tax is not about punishing anyone. It's about saying you built something great in this country, good for you. But you did it using workers all of us help pay to educate. You did it using getting your goods on roads and bridges all of us help pay for. You did it protected by police and firefighters all of us help pay the salaries for. So when you make it big, when you make it really big, when you make it top 0.1% big, pitch in 2 cents. So everybody else gets a chance to make it. And here's the thing. That's something that Democrats care about, independents care about, and Republicans care about. Because regardless of party affiliation, people understand across this country, our government is working better and better for the billionaires, for the rich, for the well-connected, and worse for everyone else. We come together when we acknowledge that and say we're going to make real change.
Thank you, Senator.
So here are the basics, if you didn't catch it, of what Warren's proposing. It's not just taxing the money that you or I would earn. It is actually on your overall wealth, meaning your assets, your pay, all things that contribute to what you're worth. The stocks, the bonds, the mutual funds, the 401ks, all of it. All of your assets, the house that you own, that car, the boat, whatever, right? Warren wants to come after every single thing that you have. Literally audit your ass every single year, by the way. So if you've got enough stuff and investments that add up to $50 million, you're going to pay 2 cents on every dollar after that 50th millionth dollar. If you've got $1 billion in assets, you're paying 6 cents on the dollar after that $1 billion mark has been reached. But let's go back to playing some audio and talking about something that Warren talked about. This concept that we have to have shared responsibility here in the United States.
Again, I agree with the need to do all of those things. We're all united in wanting to see universal preschool, and I'll fight for that. We're all united in wanting to fund HBCUs. Heck, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for 2 parents that went to HBCUs. But the tax, the way we're putting it forward right now, the wealth tax, I'm sorry, it's cumbersome. It's been tried by other nations. It's hard to evaluate. We can get the same amount of revenue through just taxation. But again, we as Democrats have got to start talking not just about how we tax from a stage, but how we grow wealth in this country amongst those disadvantaged communities that are not seeing it. Look at VC dollars in this country. 75% of them go to 3 metropolitan areas. There is worth in the inner city. There is value in our rural areas. If I am president of the United States, we're going to have a fair, just taxation where millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share. But dear God, we're going to have pathways to prosperity for more Americans. We're going to see a change in what we see right now. Small businesses, new startups are going down in this country.
Thank you,
We need to give
Senator
more
Warren.
new entrepreneurs
Senator Warren,
access
briefly,
to wealth.
just your last thoughts on this.
The idea behind what is fair. Today, the 99% in America are on track to pay about 7.2% of their total wealth in taxes.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
The top 0.1% that I want to say pay 2 cents more, they'll pay 3.2% in America. I'm tired of freeloading billionaires. I think it's time that we ask those at the very top to pay more so that every single one of our children gets a real
everybody is
chance.
tired of freeloading billionaires. Everybody's tired of corporations getting away with paying 0 taxes.
Notice how she used the term freeloading billionaires as a pejorative. Notice how she also used a few sly words in this mix as well. Notice how it was all about paying your fair share. So let's get real about who is contributing what, because her next point was this. Again, notice how she used the total wealth in this whole point. The total wealth. 7.2% of total wealth for 99%. Top 1/10 of 1% somehow only is contributing 3% of their total wealth. This is a designed line by her and her economic team, but it's also a total sleight of hand because most Americans are talking about what they're earning, not what their worth is, not what their net worth is, because that net worth could be meaningless tomorrow. Their earnings are what is being taxed today. We're not talking about their total wealth. It is completely disingenuous to conflate the two, and that's what she's doing. She's trying to make you think they're not paying their fair share because they're only paying a certain percentage of their overall wealth. Well, what about their earnings on a given year? As it turns out, if you've been paying attention forever, okay, billionaires are not just freeloading. They're the ones who are actually footing the bill. Okay? I want you to get this through your head, and I want you to understand that paying the fair share is not the upper 90% paying 50% of all of our taxes. It's not the upper, 10% or the upper 1% paying 33% or whatever the total is as of this year. But we all know that the number is the upper 90%, the upper 10% of earners, okay? They're paying 50% of all income taxes. 50%, 10%, okay? Billionaires are not just freeloading off of all of the things that these wonderful, hardworking, non-tax dodging Americans are paying for. They're also paying for the roads with their income tax. They're paying for the police. They're paying for the fire departments. They're paying for all the services that you and I pay for. And in fact, most of them are paying way more than you and I are because most of their property is worth a hell of a lot more than yours and I's property is. And property taxes go a hell of a long way for paying for schools, roads, buses, public transportation, all of the things that you can think of in a city or a county or a state. Okay? Elizabeth Warren seems to not understand that their income tax, that their property taxes already contribute to the things that she suddenly believes are just freeloading things for those millionaires and billionaires. Give me a break. Okay? I'm just going to put this out there in the ether for like the millionth time. Elizabeth Warren is full of crap when it comes to the wealth tax. Not to mention the fact that she believes that this thing can actually go through, okay? This thing can actually go through constitutionally. Not to mention this. The key question here is always this one. We always hear on the Democratic side about the shrinking middle class in America and how it's a shame that the American middle class is not as big as it once was. How is it possible that the middle class is shrinking in America? Why is it shrinking in America? That's the key question. Why? Turns out it's this $1 million idea called upward mobility. In that respect, this country is doing better than almost any other country on God's green earth. Again, I'm going to keep harping on this point like I did in episode 17 and like I've done on previous By the Numbers segments. We have gone from 8% of people earning $100,000 adjusted for 2016 money, by the way, 8% earning $100,000 or more in 1967, to just over 27% by 2016. So in 50 years, we didn't just double. We've actually more than tripled the percentage of people earning over $100,000 in America. At the same time, those people earning $35,000 or less shrunk from 38.7% to 30%. You cannot have an 8% decline in that rate without the majority of those people at least moving upwards. Some of them, it's impossible because we said 35,000 or less. They're all moving up. There it is, again, that dastardly word, upward mobility. Knowing those numbers, there's only one possible conclusion that could be drawn from people that are honest and are critically thinking through the issue of the shrinking middle class. Upward mobility is responsible for this horrific shrinking of the so-called middle class in America. Yes, folks, the middle class shrunk. Oh no! The details tell us it shrunk because more people left the middle class and became upper middle class or rich. Upper middle class or rich. And more people actually moved out of the poverty area into the middle class. Now, could we be doing a better job of that 30% number of people that are earning $35,000 or less? I would argue that the wage stagnation that's happened over the past decade or so has been largely responsible for that number not moving upwards. I would also suggest that, by and large, Americans, that 27% number of $100,000 or more is going to eventually, and I would say maybe over the next 10 years, we'll probably see another 2, 3, 4% decline in that $35,000 or less range. But let's also remember here, we're talking about earnings, which are very different than wealth, according to Elizabeth Warren. But overall, it's hard to argue that Americans today are not, if you take the same measure from 1967 to today, over the last 50 years, that by and large, America, the average wage earner in America is more wealthy today than they were 50 years ago, by 50 years ago standards. It's just not true. This idea that there's this shrinking middle class and that the wealthy are not paying their fair share, and all of the pejoratives that are hurled towards people who are making more money than other people. It's a lie that there are more people struggling today than before. They're just choosing to leave that small part out about the upward mobility because it's an inconvenient truth for the long-standing Democratic fight. Let's also not forget that unions have long driven the discussion on wages within the Democratic Party and on the national level. There's no question that wages have been the focus of unions, at least in the public sector and the private sector as of late. I mean, did you see what happened with GM? But they've driven that discussion, and they've succeeded in driving up the wages for the American worker, by and large. So I'm going to say something positive about unions. Thank you for helping drive the wage up for the average earner. Yet, the very same people inside those unions, okay, the very same people inside those unions decry the fact that people are wealthy, decry the billionaires, and they continuously ramp up the Democratic Party. They're all in on the lie. Unions are able to enrich themselves. Democrats are able to enrich themselves. Republicans are able to enrich themselves, all while fighting over this idea of a shrinking middle class. And we've got to do this for the middle class and that for the middle class. Well, it turns out that the economy by itself has done more for the middle class in the last 50 years than any politician could ever have dreamt of. Again, tripling the number of people earning over $100,000 a year in 2016 dollars is a positive thing for America. And now Elizabeth Warren wants to keep on attacking the people as they become more upwardly mobile, because as you get to that $100,000 mark, as you start earning way more money, the more money you earn, the more capital you can bring back into your portfolio as assets, the more overall wealthy you can become. The more money you're able to keep in capital, whether that's through investments, whether that's through things that you want to do, whether it's investing in your business, whether it's investing in the stock market, whether it's investing in other businesses, whatever have you, right? If you're able to take $50,000 of $100,000 a year and invest it, your returns, your return on getting to $200,000 happens much quicker than getting to that actual $100,000 mark. Now, lastly, let's also remember that this plan from Elizabeth Warren on the wealth tax is put together not by Warren's own thoughts and her own brain. It is her economic brain trust, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman. These two, they've been running around trying to convince Americans that tax rate as a percentage of income is what matters. Yet, their plan here has nothing, literally nothing to do with raising the income tax on Americans. Because if they tried that, it would hit almost everybody. It instead has to do with what? Stealing stuff from those evil and dastardly rich people to do what? Then redistribute as the government sees fit. See, it's the government that wants to enrich themselves, then decide who gets what. Not you deciding for yourself what is good for you, what you would like to donate to charity, what you would like to pay in wages to workers in a business that you may or may not want to run, what you may want to do with your own personal life. They're just going to continuously steal from it. And let's also remember this. Let's say you've got $10 billion. Okay? Let's do some math here. It's not just that one time they're going to do this. This is a yearly audit of your earnings. So they're going to take that 6 cents on every dollar over 1 billion. Let's say you've got 10 billion. They're taking that 6 cents. The next year, you only got 9 billion. They're taking 6 cents of that. Continuously on until suddenly you have no money left for them to tax anymore. And when they run out of that money, where are they going? They're going to everybody else because they need to dive into the pocketbooks. That money's got to come from somewhere because it's making up all of these other things they're promising. Free college, free childcare, free pre-K, free everything. This whole idea of the wealth tax, not only unconstitutional, but it wouldn't bring the revenue that they're asking for, because where are you have to keep on having people upwardly mobile enough to move into the 50 million, to the $1 billion range. And then you tax the crap out of them until they fall out. And then they fall back in eventually. And then they fall back out. It is not a constant stream of revenue. And if you're going to be talking about adding all of these free things, and by free things, I mean taxpayer-funded things, you have to have a constant stream of revenue. You have to know that X percentage of revenue is always going to come in. You cannot know that when it comes to this wealth tax. You just can't. It's absolutely insane to think about this from a constitutional perspective, let alone from the numbers perspective. Speaking of the Constitution, though, earlier this year, you and we talked about the fact that the next attempt to get around the Second Amendment was going to come in the form of pressure put on financial institutions. And the proof came this week, and you've likely never heard a single word about it. Not even the right side of the media, unless you're more libertarian, is actually dealing with this notion. So, what was I actually talking about, or what am I talking about? Well, first, just know that this attack on the Second Amendment is actually a two-pronged attack. And the first, we've already talked about in a previous edition of the show. Again, look up the podcast, download it, subscribe, don't miss an episode, go back and find it. But we've already talked about this two-pronged attack on the financial institutions. Would it be pressure to make banks stop giving out loans to gun manufacturers and then choke off the ability of those banks and financial institutions to transact for gun sales, period? Which one of those things would happen? It turns out the second of those two things is ready for the Democrats' prime time. But of course, this from Reason.com earlier this week. Representative Jennifer Wexton, a Democrat from Virginia, she introduced the Gun Violence Prevention Through Financial Intelligence Act, which would require the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, because everything in the federal government has to be an acronym, to, quote, request information from financial institutions for the purpose of developing an advisory about the identification and reporting of suspicious activity. The bill's aim is to identify a consistent purchasing pattern among people who buy firearms and firearm accessories in order to conduct, quote, lone wolf acts of terror, and expose how the firearms market in the United States is exploited by would-be mass shooters. So if you're not following the legalese and all that stuff there, what this wonderful individual, because I don't know if she identifies as a she or a he or an it or a they, this Representative Wexton, okay, what this individual is basically laying out is that they want pre-crime, okay? What they're talking about here is the ability for these financial institutions to take out and report and extrapolate all of this data that's coming in on the transactions on debit cards, credit cards, that are associated with firearm purchases and accessory purchases, start to understand what a normal pattern is, and then extrapolate what are the abnormal purchases, and then take this out and measure it against these so-called lone wolf attacks. That's what they're really looking at here, okay? They're trying to find pre-crime, if you will. Now, it goes on, by the way, Wexton actually says this in the statement, quote, banks, credit card companies, and retailers have unique insight into the behavior and purchasing patterns that can help identify and prevent mass shootings, Wexton explained in her own statement. The red flags are there. Someone just needs to be paying attention. But as they talk about these lone wolf attacks and knowing the red flags are there, what are these red flags? Well, it's likely that Wexton's pointing to reporting that was done by the New York Times, a former newspaper of record, by the way. And that report told us in 2018 that according to Reason, this is what they're saying that this New York Times report said back in 2018. In at least 8 of the 13 mass shootings that killed 10 or more people within that time span from Virginia Tech going forward, the perpetrators used credit cards to finance their killing sprees. So 8 of the 13 mass shootings, the perpetrators used credit cards to finance their killing sprees. So that dude, remember, I do not use the names of mass shooters on this show. They do not deserve our attention. That dude who killed 12 people at the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado back in the day, used a credit card to purchase more than $11,000 worth of guns, grenades, and other military gear prior to his rampage. The Pulse nightclub shooter in Orlando ran up $26,532 in charges across 6 credit card accounts in the 12 days leading up to his attack. Now that's interesting information, and there's certainly ways that we should look at the correlations between what they're doing and the attacks. There's ways to find out, right? And look at that information as good data to understand. So naturally, there's got to be pre-crime and a pattern here that we've got to give access to the federal government for. They've got to stop these people from committing whatever act they possibly were going to commit. Never mind the rights of the millions of gun owners. Never mind all of that. Never mind the fact that the average gun owner in America owns 4 guns. Never mind the fact that it's wholly unconstitutional for the federal government to just willy-nilly pick up records when you aren't accused of an actual crime. Never mind the fact that the financial institutions, their liability here would be so great that they would just literally just hand everything over. Hand it all over. Because nobody wants to be sued for not handing over the right information that could have prevented a crime. After all, you're seeing Smith & Wesson. They might be on the hook for a state trial in Connecticut over the Sandy Hook shooting. They're literally going to be on the hook for a shooting, held civilly liable for a shooting that happened with a gun that was legally bought by the mother of that shooter. And thankfully, Visa and MasterCard have stood up to this kind of stuff in the past. What other kinds of goods and services would MasterCard and Visa now also have to search through? What massive bureaucracy would they put in place, not to mention the bureaucracy of the federal government, to have to track all of this stuff? The algorithms that would have to be created, the manpower to actually investigate once the algorithm says, red alert, red alert, red alert. It's absolute insanity. And I think, folks, this is a good place to stop here on this show of absolute insanity for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. If so, please give us a follow on social media at Mojo50 Radio. You can give me a follow at The Coppin Show. Until next week, be safe, be smart, and as always, Epstein didn't kill himself.